Welcome all to the launch of the World Climate and Security Report 2021. We'll give folks just a few moments here to sign in as the attendees roll in. So just give it a couple more minutes here as everyone gets signed in through Zoom to this event. But you're here for the International Military Council on Climate and Security, the release of its World Climate and Security Report 2021. All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Sikorski, and I am the director of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, and I welcome you all here today to the launch of our 2021 World Climate and Security Report, the second version of this report. Very happy to be here with such a distinguished panel of guests and speakers to talk about this critical issue today. And I'm going to begin by turning it over to General Tom Middendorp, who is the chair of the IMCCS and the former Chief of Defense Forces of the Netherlands. He's going to kick us off today with this important discussion. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Erin. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch event of the World Climate and Security Report 2021, a report set up by the International Military Council on Climate and Security, a network organization that brings together senior security experts, research institutes, and government officials in a non-political and non-governmental network. The IMCCS was announced during the Planetary Security Conference in 2019, where it was initiated by 4 consortium members. It's only 2 years young and has rapidly developed into a worldwide network with experts from all continents and with 17 institutional partners. And what unites us all is a firm belief that climate change is probably the biggest game changer of this century, and certainly much more than an environmental problem. All over the world, we experienced how climate change affects our security, how increasing water and food shortages lead to internal friction and conflicts, how it drives local population into the hands of organized crime and extremist organizations, how it changes our geopolitical environment, and how it threatens our key infrastructure, and how it is becoming a peace inhibitor. To us, climate change is also a matter of national and international security that requires us to adapt and to be prepared. The security sector needs to take this more seriously and needs to become part of the solution. And since we launched IMCCS, we had a remarkable, successful few years. More than a few governments have turned to the IMCCS for advice on how they can better incorporate climate trends into their planning, analysis, and operations. And we've been closely involved with the organization of many climate meetings and security summits to ensure better interaction across these issues and to raise the awareness of the security dimension. Last year, we published our first World Climate and Security Report 2020, and this proved to be very timely and instrumental in raising the awareness within the security communities around the world. Institutions like NATO are beginning to lean into the climate security nexus more seriously for the first time, and closely following many of our other recommendations. Our research in that first report and subsequent detailed studies on the Asia Pacific and South America have provided much needed detail on a set of complex emerging risks. It showed how climate change affects all regions in the world, especially the most vulnerable ones. It also helped to clarify that climate change is not just a security issue, as it isn't just an environmental issue. It's a whole of society problem requiring more comprehensive answers. And now, with the launch of the 2021 World Climate and Security Report, we look more to the future, offering detailed case studies of growing regional threats, forecasts about how these risks will unfold in the decades ahead, and tangible solutions that policymakers can implement quickly. Meanwhile, we were all struck by a devastating pandemic that hit the globe, a pandemic that should teach us how vulnerable we are in our global village. We can't look the other way and hide behind our national boundaries, behind oceans, or in the case of the Netherlands, behind our dikes, since they don't protect us against the effects of pandemics or changing climate. The pandemic also demonstrated how important it is to not deny the signals and to not let time slip through our fingers, but to adapt, to be prepared, and to build resilience. It showed us there is no easy, popular way out. Comprehensive problems require comprehensive answers, and global problems require global answers, whether we like it or not. And this reality is the backdrop for the 2021 report, but also informs some of its key findings. The experts surveyed in our Climate Security Risk Perception Survey specifically point to cascading threats caused by climate change as a key area that requires more preparation and resilience investments. We must learn the harsh lessons from COVID-19 and quickly climate-proof our security systems to be prepared for the compound risks of a changing climate before it's too late. In our event today, you'll hear from a variety of experts who are at the forefront of these issues, leading the push for confronting climate security threats domestically and internationally. We have much more work to be done, but it is our hope that this new IMCCS partnership can serve as a model for how to do this across borders, across languages, across departments, in the spirit of partnership and collaboration. With such global and complex threats, this is the only means we have. However, before we dive into today's program, I would like to introduce and pay tribute to a very special guest today. A guest whom I met during last year's Munich Security Conference, who I learned to appreciate. A guest who supported the development of our 2021 report as our main sponsor, but most of all a guest with a mission, who proved to be a driving political force within the NATO and EU institutions in putting the climate security nexus on the agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the program and a very warm welcome to Minister Francois Bausch, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, and the Minister of Mobility and Public Works of Luxembourg. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. Excellencies, Ambassadors, dear Ms. Gottemoeller, dear Assistant Secretary General of NATO, dear friends of the International Military Council on Climate Security, ladies and gentlemen, more and more evidence has shown the implications of changing climate for peace and security. The immediate effects of climate change occur in terms of internal conflicts, whilst climate change is certainly not the only cause of conflict. It aggravates its underlying causes and it's considered by experts as a multiplier of risks and threats. The World Climate and Security Report 2021 shows that climate change is having a significant effect on armed conflict within states. This effect will increase sharply with rising global temperatures. Careful modeling suggests that climate change could lead to a 50% increase in conflict in sub-Saharan Africa alone, for example. This would result in several hundred thousands additional deaths and the displacement of millions of people, and contribute to the transnational terrorism and mass migration. It is therefore imperative that we systematically integrate the risks and threats arising from climate change into our foreign security, defense, and development cooperation policies. The best practices and policy recommendations proposed in the report can thereby be of a great relevance. The COVID-19 crisis has clearly shown us that at the 21st century, an understanding of security needs to include non-traditional risks and threats, such as climate change, within a border of more comprehensive concept of security. Those risks and threats need to be adequately assessed, mitigated, and prepared for. Reinforced intelligence cooperation between partners and allies is also key. Early warning and strategic foresight need to be given more emphasis in order to prepare for early action and to prevent conflicts from breaking. Ex-ante mediation and peacekeeping efforts will need to become central elements of our future security and defense policies. Given that these are not necessarily traditional areas of armed forces expertise, cooperation with civilian mediators and peacekeeping actors is essential. Moreover, a future-proof security and defense policy should also contribute to resilience-building efforts within a whole-of-government approach. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense sector is, however, not only affected by a changing climate, but also by its carbon emission also contributing to global warming. Even though there have been attempts to green certain aspects of military operations, defense remains the single largest institutional consumer of hydrocarbons in the world. And with increased defense capabilities, emissions are likely to rise further unless we start using carbon-neutral energy sources. Moreover, given the long life cycle of military aircraft, warship, and other vehicles, the defense sector has locked itself into a hydrocarbon-based dependency for several years to come. This is why we need to start today by investing massively into research and development of carbon-neutral fuels and propulsion systems for military vehicles on air, sea, and land. Other than helping us to reduce our carbon footprint, such investments will also contribute to make our military missions and operations safer and more effective. Moreover, given the dual nature of such investments, they could also have some positive spillover effects to the civilian sector, in particular for the suffering civilian aviation industry, or looking for less energy-intensive and more cost-effective business models after the COVID-19 pandemic. Climate change has been part of the security agendas of the European Union and NATO for several years, but in practice, it has only been dealt with on the sidelines. We should therefore take advantage of the currently ongoing reflection process at NATO and European Union to ensure that the rising risks and threats related to climate change are fully reflected in NATO's updated strategic concepts and the EU's strategic compass. As the world looks to the climate COP conference this November, we should capitalize on the global momentum of this climate summit and lead strong climate security action in the months ahead. Such action includes significantly increasing investments into research and development for carbon neutral fuels and propulsion systems for military aircraft, ships, and other vehicles. Climate security leadership also includes systematically mapping our emissions in order to address the lack of data on energy consumption in greenhouse gas emissions in the defense sector. Based on such data, we should consider the setting of voluntary targets to reduce the carbon emissions of militaries in the framework of a global climate and security pledge, which we could officially announce at the COP26 in Glasgow. We should always bear in mind that we are the generations meaningful change. Future generations may not have this chance anymore. So let us not waste this opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, I would like to commend and thank the expert groups of the International Military Council of Climate and Security for the outstanding analysis, the development of a new risk evaluation methodology, and the very relevant assessment of currently existing best practices. I sincerely hope that the assessments and the recommendations made in this report will help us to further fuel and shape the debate for more concrete action on climate change and security in this important year. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. Those were wonderful remarks and really set the stage for our discussion today and really raise climate ambition among the military and security community. And so thank you very much for your support and for raising the bar and enabling our security sector to lead by example. Well, there's no one that is better able to talk about leading by example than Rose Gottemoeller, who I'm very privileged and honored now to introduce. Rose Gottemoeller, as you will all know, sir, is an American diplomat who served as the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and prior to that served as the US Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. And prior to that, she served in many various positions in the US government, where I had the privilege to work with her directly during the Clinton administration. And what I know about Rose, who has dedicated her life to public service in her very many capacities in and out of government, is that she is always trying to turn the problem into a solution in everything she does, from reducing the threat of nuclear proliferation to reducing chemical weapons, to addressing in her own and determined way over many years, addressing environmental and climate security and bringing that into the mainstream of all the organizations with which she's worked. I had the privilege of serving on her International Security Advisory Board when she was at the State Department. And no one is better able to address now the meaning and the message of the World Climate Security Report in the context of NATO and global security. Rose, it's a deep privilege and honor to have you with us this morning. We know you have a hard stop at 1/2 the hour, so I'll turn it right over to you.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Thank you to Sherry Goodman and to Aaron Sikorski for this opportunity to be with you all today. General Middendorf and Deputy Prime Minister Bausch, it's a great honor to be on the same platform with you, if only for a brief period. I was thrilled when Sherry approached me about having a small word of greetings to this conference. It's really quite an honor for me. And Deputy Prime Minister, I couldn't agree with you more with your comment that prior to this time, these issues have only been dealt with at the margins at NATO. And I will say a few more words about that in a moment, but I did want to say a big expression of gratitude again for your support, for Luxembourg's support for this important report, World Climate and Security. I think it's really a remarkable document, and I really commend all the efforts that have gone into it. The Assistant Secretary General of NATO, I know, is going to talk about NATO's plans for the summit, so I will not step on your message, sir, but I did want to make one important point, and that is that one of the top objectives of the NATO summit on the 14th of June is couched as follows. We will take decisions to sharpen our technological edge and our understanding of the security implications of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, this would simply have been an impossible statement as a top objective for a NATO summit while I was Deputy Secretary General between 2016 and 2019. Indeed, when I was Deputy Secretary General, it was extraordinarily difficult to speak publicly about climate change matters. I was able to do so, and I insisted that I would do so as DSG by talking about the important work NATO was doing even then to create more opportunities for our troops in the field, to loosen our tight link back to our pipeline network and try to develop more dispersed means and more ecologically friendly means of producing energy for our troops in the field for our operational missions. So there were ways that we could talk about climate change even during that period, but it was extraordinarily difficult to do so. So I am very, very pleased to see the planning going on for the summit meeting coming up in 1 week's time on June 14th. I am really impressed with the amount of work on the new technologies that I can see, having recently been briefed on that matter. And I do believe that there will be a significant effort now at NATO, a high priority placed on this issue, and that NATO as an institution will be a very positive and energetic partner for the work that will continue to be done on this matter among the militaries who are members of the NATO alliance, but the broader community of partners, not only in the military, but I know in other sectors, non-governmental and the corporate world. So I do very much appreciate the opportunity once again to speak with you this morning. I very much regret that I have another responsibility. I have to speak in a few minutes elsewhere. So I will again just convey my greetings to you all, my great thanks to you for this opportunity for a brief intervention, and my expression of appreciation for all the work that has been done so far. Sherry, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Rose. That was a wonderful set of remarks and really drives home how the defense and security sector can be part of the solution, not only part of the challenge, and how far we've come in just a very short period of time. And that's thanks to your work and so many, the work of so many here. So let me, Aaron, if this is right, shall I just launch into my remarks, or is there something else that we're supposed to do?
No, that's fantastic. I was going to just introduce you, but everyone knows you, I think, already as Secretary General of IMCCS and your great work on this issue. And we wouldn't be here without you either leading us. So thank you, Rose, and over to you, Sherry.
Well, thank you, Aaron, for that, and to Rose for your terrific reflections. And I certainly thank very much my partner in this endeavor, General Tom Mittendorf. We have been sailing these seas here now for a couple of years, and we are really blessed to have a great partner also in Luxembourg. So again, thank you to Deputy Prime Minister Bausch and to Roel, who works hand in hand with us. And I also want to especially thank the IMCCS expert group for hosting this event, and all our partners, the Center for Climate and Security, the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and the Klingendahl Center for International Relations, and the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. It's really remarkable what we have been able to achieve in just a short period of time. And I, reflect back that I was working on the earlier chapter of these issues in the 1990s with NATO and other security partners, trying to bring environmental awareness, environmental security, as we called it, in mill-to-mill collaboration. And we knew then that we wanted to enable the security sector, not just to be part of the problem, but to be part of the solution. And now I think we really are in a place where we can do that. from the early days in NATO of the Committee on Challenges for a Modern Society, where we were struggling to define what is environmental security, to mill cooperation around the world. I think we have come so far in the quarter century that I've been working in this area that I'm so excited to discuss today the current climate security crisis that we already face, but what are the actions we can take to do it? And as we've seen since the inaugural release of the World Climate Security Report at the Munich Security Conference last year, there has been an evident shift in awareness and acceptance of the critical security issue we face with climate, not only because of the US election, which we are very thankful for, but just because of the continuing spate almost every day of disastrous extreme events taking their toll on lives and livelihoods of people around the world. When we characterized this as a threat multiplier some 15 years ago now, little did we think that it would be a threat multiplier virtually every single day. And that's why when we talk about, so importantly, how do we integrate climate change into defense and security strategy plans and programs, it's good. It's great to say it. Everyone's saying it now, but now we actually have to do it. And that is what this World Climate Security Report is about. And that's why I'm very excited about it, because it really gives us a whole set of tools and security planners, a set of tools to take actionable steps. Okay, the report dives into climate security assessments for some critical hotspot regions, as the Deputy Prime Minister referenced, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, an area of critical continuing drought, migration, food and water insecurity. But it provides concrete tools to make it easier for policymakers to address these growing threats. And finally, the US administration, in the executive orders that President Biden has issued since almost day one, really calls for integrating these kinds of tools from wargaming, foresight, modeling, and simulation into our planning and processes. And that's why one of the key tools offered in this report is a climate security risk matrix and methodology, which allows for evaluation of climate risk among countries. I'm really excited to see that put into action. And also the climate risk security risk perception survey, which aggregates forecasts of climate risk from some top climate security experts. And what's notable here is that we know we're finding natural disasters, increased inequality, biodiversity loss, which was not always on the radar. And I'll say this is going to be a growing trend of ecological security risks combined with infectious diseases. COVID and climate share much in common. That's a whole nother discussion we need to have. And forced displacement among some of the most pressing issues that the world faces now, and prioritizes those risks for the decades ahead. So between the risk matrix, the survey, some climate security case studies, policy recommendations, there's a lot of meat in this report. And I know we have many experts who are listening to us now, and I hope you will be able to utilize those tools in your work and also share them more broadly. Because while climate change is becoming more present in the security agendas now of the US, of the EU, of NATO, too little action has been seriously implemented. And we should take advantage of this current time period to supercharge and deeply integrate these issues into NATO's strategic concept, EU strategic compass, and the US national security and national defense strategies as well. Particularly the climate risk analysis that the US Department of Defense is now undertaking, and the national intelligence estimate of climate change that our intelligence community is undertaking. Now, it's important to note, as the Deputy Prime Minister observed, that the security and defense sectors themselves contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So, and are often one of the largest users of fossil fuels in their countries. Now, this is an issue that I've personally worked on closely. I actually worked on understanding greenhouse gas emissions from the US Department of Defense in the very first, in the run-up to the very first major global climate negotiations in Kyoto in the late 1990s, and how we would allocate emissions reduction targets across the US defense sector. That was an early case that enabled us first to begin tracking them, which is the first thing, which is you have to count, you have to measure before you can manage. I firmly believe it's right now is the time to invest into research and development of these carbon neutral fuels and systems for our military vehicles on land, sea, and air. Some of that work has already begun. We've already tested biofuels. We're moving rapidly now to electrify vehicle fleets in the US military. And that's among many places in these non-tactical vehicles where militaries can lead by example. They can lead by example and use their buying power because, for example, in the US, the Department of Defense leases 165,000 tactical vehicles annually. And if it electrifies most of that fleet, that will help towards nationwide goals of setting up charging stations and using its buying power to lead much needed change. So also in research and development, some of our greatest innovations since World War II have come out of the defense sector, from the internet to GPS. There's no reason why DARPA, the new ARPA-C, other innovations and research and development centers that are hosted or closely aligned with our military sector should also be leading now. And the world will be paying close attention to these issues at the UN Climate Change Conference at COP26 in November. That's why I'm so glad that we have Lieutenant General Richard Nugee joining us today, who's really leading, got that target that he's leading for us on behalf of all of us in the defense sector. So we're very proud to be working with you, General Nugee. We want to make climate security a prominent lane for global discussion and cooperation as part of the COP. And I love the idea with the creation of a global climate and security pledge among climate and security actors. That could be, this could be an important way to come together as a security sector to really lead by example in a way that helps us further mainstream climate and security, not only recognition of the challenge, but also to be part of the solution. And that's why I'm so excited again for the World Climate Security Report that we're kicking off here today, in the hopes that it will contribute to further leadership, both at the NATO summit next week and at the COP in November, to really raise the ambition on climate and security, not just the ambition, but the action towards moving us to decarbonize our economies and understand and reduce the risks of climate security threats so we can create a better future for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for those remarks and for really providing an overview of the report and the pieces that are in it. Now we're going to have an opportunity to dig into that report in a little bit more detail and hear from some of the folks who are leading by example on these issues. We'll have a panel discussion now moderated by Captain Steve Brock, who is the Chief of Staff of the IMCCS and the lead author of this report. I'm going to turn it over to Steve to introduce the panelists, and then we can go from there. But thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, General Middendorf, and of course to Rose, who's now moved on to her next event. But over to you, Steve.
Thank you so much, Erin. And welcome to the portion of the event where we get to participate with you. So we look forward to your questions for the Q&A session. We'll do the panel first. Each one of the speakers will speak, and then we'll have an exciting Q&A session to follow. As Erin mentioned, I'm the lead author of the report, and I'd like to thank all of the other co-authors across the entire consortium, and especially also thank the government of Luxembourg for their outstanding support to the report. We have three great panelists. The first panelist is the Assistant Secretary General at NATO for emerging security threats. He advises the Secretary General on how these emerging security challenges affect the alliance. And prior to coming to NATO, he was the Foreign Policy and Defense Advisor for the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Assistant Secretary General David van Weel. we are very honored to have you on the panel. We were honored in 2020 at the Munich Security Conference to have your colleague, Benedetta Berti Alberti, be on the inaugural panel, and she has kept us apprised in the following 18 months about how the initial report helped at the NATO planning level with the framework and the other initiatives that you've embarked on there. So we thank you for your leadership in that regard. NATO is one of the preeminent multilateral institutions in the world, and as climate change and climate security know no borders, it's great to have you here to explain how you are working across borders to make this a priority to meet the threat that's facing us all. So without further ado, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Steve, and it's an honor to be here amongst these distinguished speakers that we just heard. And I think that the thing that struck me the most was Rose's intervention when she said that during her time as Deputy Secretary General, it would have been unthinkable to have a summit deliverable on climate change and security. So I feel lucky to be in this position now in this time when this is really, really changing. And I think you'll find that in the summit next week, climate change and security is one of the main topics and one of the main deliverables coming out of this summit, in conjunction with what you already mentioned, the investment in our technological edge. And I'll touch upon where these two intertwine, in my opinion, and can mutually reinforce each other to help NATO into the next decade. So what's been done in this past year? Knowing that Benedetta has kept you well informed, and we really work hand in glove on these topics. But in February this year, the foreign ministers of the NATO countries of the alliance have adopted a climate change and security agenda, which basically sets out the course for NATO for the coming decade into how they want to tackle the issue of climate change in relation to security and the alliance and allied forces. And based upon that agenda, we've been working on a climate action plan, which will hopefully be endorsed by the leaders, the heads of state and government next week, Monday, during the summit. And this action plan, and I heard it from Sherry very well, it's about taking action. It's not about writing policies, but stuff needs to happen. This action plan will do exactly that. And it will do that alongside four main strands of work. The first one of which is awareness. We need to become aware of the impact of climate change on security. And that's the first order effects. I mean, it's the actual infrastructure in allied countries vital to our defenses that are being affected by climate change directly, but it's also the second and the third order consequences. We've heard the ecosystem, we've heard migration, we've heard the biodiversity arguments. So how do we become more aware as NATO as to where climate change is going to affect our security directly, but also indirectly in the regions that surround us? And this needs to be a continuous process. So we'll make sure that within this action plan, we will have a continuous focus on where the security implications are changing and where NATO needs to pay more attention. And your report is one of the things that will really, really help us in raising this bar of awareness. So once again, thank you very much for that. I haven't been able to read it in full, but rest assured that I definitely will and will take it to heart. The second pillar is the pillar of adaptation. And adaptation comes in different forms as well. It's adapting to harsher circumstances in which our military will have to operate. So higher temperatures, colder temperatures, more frequent disaster relief tasks. So that's a very tangible direct effect to our military that we have to take into account. But it's also about adapting to a world that's transitioning away from fossil fuel. So how can we adapt our armed forces? And it was related to earlier by the use of new and green technologies. How can we make them more energy efficient? And how can we make sure that the military is not left behind? No, rather, can they be leading in developing technologies that will help us green our militaries? And there, I always present this as a win-win because energy efficiency means less use of fuel, which saves costs and money, but also saves lives because you need less dangerous logistic operations delivering fuel to soldiers in contested areas. The third pillar is mitigation, and that was alluded to by the Deputy Prime Minister as one of the first speakers here. The military is also a polluter and an emitter of CO2. So how do we get the military to become more energy efficient? And that starts, I think, by, first of all, as it was mentioned by a few, in knowing what the emissions are. Where did they come from? How do we map our emissions across the alliance? Some allies have already started doing this. How do we build upon that knowledge in order to create the opportunity for all our armed forces to look into where their emissions lie, but then also to look like what can be done on this. It was already mentioned, why don't we talk to industry on issues of energy efficiency and climate change, and try to be a force in enforcing the new technologies in becoming less fuel consuming than the other way around. So also in mitigation, I believe there's a role to play in NATO and the allied armed forces in order to contribute. The final pillar, and then I'll stop for now, is outreach, because nothing about climate is happening in isolation. So NATO needs to engage, not only internally with the 30 countries, which of course is a big start, but it needs to engage with the private sector when it comes down to the new technologies that we need, with academia in looking at the innovations that will help us in making this green transition. But we also need to reach out to other organizations that deal with climate change. So of course, NATO is not the first responder to climate change, but it can definitely make a vital contribution when it comes down to the knowledge on climate change and the security implications. And I think that next week, we'll see some big first steps in this direction. So let me leave it at that for now, Steve.
Thank you so much for those comments. And I know folks are out there working on their questions right now to put in the chat regarding NATO. Next, I'd like to turn to our second panelist, Aaron Sikorski, who is the director of the IMCCS, also the deputy director of the Center for Climate Security. And before coming to us, she was the deputy director for the Strategic Futures Group at the National Intelligence Council here in the United States. I also want to pay a heartfelt tribute and a great deal of gratitude to Erin for the tremendous work she did helping us get the report over the finish line. So without further ado, Erin, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. And thanks to all our panelists for the discussion today. You know, it's really an honor for me to be here as I've transitioned out of the US government into the nonprofit, non-governmental sector. I'm really thrilled to have joined the International Military Council and the great work you've all done. I mean, this report reflects over a year of work from an incredible team of experts across the globe. And what a year it's been to actually see these issues play out in real time, and the convergence of the COVID-19 pandemic and repeated climate hazards underscoring the interconnected and overlapping nature of the climate security threat, as we've heard from other panelists, whether you're looking at the fires in California, hurricanes in Central America, drought and a locust plague in East Africa, to monsoon floods in South Asia. Climate shocks layered on top of the pandemic have stressed societies and undermined stability and security around the globe. And really, this is just a warning of what's to come in the future. And at the same time, as other panelists have highlighted as well, we've seen a growing recognition by governments and policymakers of the links between climate and security. So from the White House to the UN Security Council, over to NATO headquarters, really to the African Union based in Ethiopia, we've seen senior leaders regularly reiterating the importance of the security dimensions of climate change. And of course, that's in large part due to the great work by people on this panel here today and the work of IMCCS and its previous report launched last year. As Sherry said, there's general agreement about the problem now, and policymakers now are turning to the question, which is a harder question, of what to do about it. And that's where this report this year comes in. I had three things from the report I wanted to highlight, three key takeaways that I think help in that vein. But before I get to those, I think it's really important to note that there are two sides of the climate security coin that we're talking about today. One is aimed at addressing today's risks, the risks we've already bought. And the other is about preventing tomorrow's. And what I mean by that is we have to address the risks that are already there due to the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere already. We need to build adaptation and resilience to manage these risks that are here in the next 10 to 20 years. But then we also, as other speakers have said, have to cut emissions to avoid catastrophic security risks in the second half of the century. So you have to be able to do both, and security institutions, that's why I'm so thrilled to hear the Assistant Secretary General lay out NATO's plan and others, that it's aimed at both of those pieces of the climate security coin to get us to truly climate proof our security policy. And again, when I think you read through this report, we really aim at both of those measures. So what are the three aspects I wanted to highlight for the group today? The first is that this is really, climate security risks are a global problem. No region is immune. I often say that if you spun a globe and put your finger down anywhere on that globe, you could describe some level of climate security risk there. It isn't just a problem in fragile states. It isn't just a problem in the global south. And one of the key challenges now is that disasters are coming so frequently that communities have a very hard time responding and building back from one hazard before a next one hits. If you look at the wildfires in California or in Australia in 2020, and look what's happened in the year since, I mean, that's an example of that right there. The other piece of the global nature of the problem is that what happens in one part of the world has implications for other parts of the world. And this comes out very clearly in the EU section of this year's World Climate and Security Report, where they talk in depth about some of the climate security risks in the Middle East and North Africa, for example, and what that means for Europe and Europe's risks that it faces and how it thinks about managing climate security risks going forward. So you can't isolate these risks in various parts of the world. They're all interconnected. So that's the first takeaway. The problem is global. The second takeaway is something that others have talked about a bit, but it's the importance of taking action, right? But taking action requires the integration of both robust tools as well as local perspectives on these challenges. So Sherry and others talked about being able to take advantage of predictive capabilities and new modes of gathering information. And we have both of those in this report through the survey and the risk matrix. But we also have to make sure that the interventions that we're thinking about in terms of climate security have a local perspective and get that information on the ground. And that's what comes out in the report in the evaluation of the nascent best practices for climate security interventions, is how to think about how to make sure you're understanding the local dynamics and the local issues at play in developing climate security interventions. As a former intelligence analyst, I think all of these pieces that are in this report are the kinds of things we need to see integrated across all aspects of government, whether in the United States or elsewhere. But when doing these assessments of climate risks, you need tools that are rooted in data and predictive capabilities, but you also need that on the ground local understanding of the issues and how the risks are playing out. This report provides that. The third key takeaway I wanted to highlight, and I think this is really important as well, and this really reflects a lot of Steve's good work in the report, so kudos to him on that, but that we're in a moment where we need new norms, new rules, new international mechanisms to help manage these climate security risks. The global governance system as it currently exists is ill-equipped to deal with many of these risks posed by climate change. In some cases, you have international law that's modeled on outdated understandings of climate impacts or outdated assumptions about how things work. In other places, you have international law or norms that don't exist yet to manage climate security risks. So when you're looking at issues such as irregular migration due to climate change, that's where you have an example of outdated systems that don't match the threat. And you look at issues of solar geoengineering, that's where you have an example where you don't have anything that exists yet, and the science is getting ahead of the international system. And so to manage the threats that are arising from these issues, you need to tackle it at the international level and find new ways to understand and manage these. And that's a key part of the discussion in this report as well. So those are 3 areas that I would highlight for the group, and happy to answer questions on those or anything else. But back over to you, Steve, now to move on.
Thanks so much, Erin. Our final panelist is Lieutenant General Richard Nugee from the UK. He is the Climate Change and Sustainability Strategy Lead for the UK Ministry of Defence, and has been working tirelessly and successfully in getting climate security integrated into COP26 in Scotland next November. And as in his current job, and also as a very successful career military officer, he is well positioned to explain to us the threats to militaries of climate change, on a individual military basis. Also, it's very fitting that he is the final speaker today before we move into the Q&A and bring us home on this anchor leg, because he's about to get on a bike and ride 1,000 miles from one end of Britain to the in support of wounded warriors. So, sir, thank you very much for everything, and the floor is yours.
Steve, thank you very much indeed, and it's a great honour to be on such a distinguished panel. I hugely welcome the report and the focus that it brings to this whole subject of climate and security. It is a subject which seems to have really come of age in the last year to 18 months, and I think that's something which is very significant indeed. It was described to me that you cannot talk about climate change without understanding the implications of security as well, because it's going to hit you whether you like it or not. And we need to be aware of climate change and security, and this report really brings that home. And I also welcome very much the Assistant Secretary General's comments about NATO and NATO taking this seriously. And I would say that our analysis and our approach in the UK is very similar to NATO, and I really welcome NATO's leadership on this as an opportunity to really bring the whole of the alliance together on such an important subject. I suppose it falls to me to talk about how a little bit of detail and what is it that's going to, if you like, affect militaries, particularly through climate change. And we've heard a bit about how humanitarian assistance and disaster relief is going to become more common, and that gives us opportunity for sharing skills, sharing processes, even sharing the geographical location, so that we sort of share the burden a little bit. This sort of thing is done ad hoc at the moment. I'm sure that there's opportunity for militaries to work much closer together if it's going to become more frequent. And as an observation, we put a ship in the Caribbean. Used to be once every 4 or 5 years. Now we put it in routinely every year to support those nations and those small island states that need support after the hurricane season. We've also heard about self-sufficiency and being less reliant on logistic resupply, a really important aspect for militaries, not only more efficient, more effective, but saves lives. And I'm constantly reminded that the US military lost somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 soldiers through its logistic resupplies in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we in the UK lost our most senior officer in a logistic resupply patrol. Interestingly, an infantryman, so that the patrol was protected. That sort of thing, if you reduce the number of logistic resupplies, will allow the infantry to go and do other things, which will be better for the military. But then you look at what is the effect of climate change going to have? It's going to have an effect on various parts of the world, perhaps in more extreme than others. So if you look at the Arctic, 15 to 20 years, we're assuming that the Arctic in the summer will melt and there will be free-flowing water. We need to be prepared for that. We need to prepare to understand the geopolitical implications of that, because I think that Russia, by planting a flag under the North Pole, has claimed it as an internal sea, and we need to understand what that means for NATO and what that means for us as militaries within NATO as to how we can protect ourselves if necessary, and how we can patrol up there if necessary, not only in the free-flowing water, the open water of the summer, but in that interim period between the open water and the hard ice, which I know the Canadians call disruptive ice. We need to prepare our ships to be able to operate in that. Similarly, but at another extreme, the surface sea temperatures that our scientists are predicting will be in the Gulf in the summer in about 20 years' time will preclude our ability to operate our ships with their current engines. Ships, as everybody knows, uses the cold seawater to cool their engines. Well, already we're beginning to have problems on really hot days with those engines cutting out at a lower speed than we would anticipate and wish. We need to find another way of cooling those engines rather than the very hot water that is likely to be around in the Gulf in about 20 years' time. But if those are the obvious, the less obvious are things like sensors, unmanned underwater sensors, for example. The melting of the ice of the Arctic and variously is changing the viscosity of the water, which we rely on in order to be able to use our submarines in particular areas and our underwater sensors. We need to understand that. We need to understand the implications of that. We need to adapt to different amounts of freshwater and salt water in our seas. And whilst that may not sound particularly worrying at the moment, come perhaps 15, 20 years' time, I think we will see some real concerns over whether we can use those sensors. And of course, sensors are affected by other things such as hazardous algae bloom and so on, which close inshore will make it more difficult for us to operate covertly as we would wish. Rising sea level, it's been mentioned, but the idea of resilience of our bases, resilience of our ports, and it's not, actually sea levels are not going to rise very significantly in the next 10 to 20 years. But after that, if we don't do anything, at the peak of a very high tide, and so a spring tide, as we would describe it, and a storm may well overwhelm some of our ports, and we need to understand that and act against making sure that that becomes too much of a problem. And then there's all our surveillance and reconnaissance ideas, sensors and equipments. They are damaged by the intensity of rain, for example. If rain is going to be, if you like, delivered in much shorter bursts of much more intense storms, our sensors can't see through that anything like. Our optical sensors, our passive IR sensors become unreliable in harsh weather. We need to understand what the implications are of that. Even our radio frequencies are affected, and particularly in the Arctic, where you've got much more effect from what's called space weather, or if you like, what's coming out of the sun. Even there, we need to understand the implications and do something about it to make sure that we're not left without sensors at a critical point in time. I could go on about other areas, aviation, about our training areas needing to be more protected against wildfires, about the heat of the training estate, so that actually, for example, one of our training areas in Cyprus and Akrotiri, we're anticipating, as opposed to losing 40% of our time for the training area to be too hot to train, we're looking at 100% of our time in the summer not being able to train there because it's just too hot for our people. And it's an obvious given that medically we have a problem with diseases being slightly more prevalent. But one that I thought that would be worth mentioning is cyber and the interconnectivity of electricity. As we all move to more and more electricity, more and more electrical supply, that provides an opportunity to target for those who want to attack our critical national infrastructure and attack our interconnectivity of electrical supply. That's something we need to be aware of. It reinforces the importance of being self-sufficient as militaries, so you're off the grid and producing your own energy if that is something that you would wish to do, so that you are more protected and more resilient. And I think there's a huge piece about resilience. And very briefly, how do we make this stick? We make this stick in the militaries by changing our processes. So we are changing our procurement processes, we're changing our finance processes to look to delegate to where somebody can actually have material effect at a base level, a sort of garrison level, a station level, rather than having everything centralized. We're looking to change our commercial practices, and the UK is about to announce, and I understand it's one of the first countries to do so, a policy which says that any contractor who wants to bid for a contract worth more than £5 million must have a plan as a contractor to get to net zero. Otherwise, their bid will just be wiped out. So if you don't change your own process as an industry and have a plan to get to net zero, this is something that we dreamt up a little while ago to get after, if you like, our scope 3, to get after our defense industry and say, how are you going to change? Well, we're going to force them to do so by saying, if you don't have a plan to get to net zero, I'm afraid you're not going to get a contract with government. And it's not just MOD, it's the whole government. And the Cabinet Office are due to announce that in the next few weeks, I hope to come into effect by the end of September. That's really exciting. That's really dynamic. And I hope the rest of the world will follow us on that, that if you want to contract with government, you have to have a route to net zero. We're changing our governance. We're changing our behaviors. We're changing our communication system. And importantly, we're really celebrating now, which we weren't doing even 6 months ago. We're really celebrating what we're doing in terms of trying to reduce emissions. So we had the Chief of the General Staff, the head of the Army, put into one of our national newspapers only last week that he has opened 4 of 70 solar farms on Army soil in order to try and get us more resilient and off the grid. And actually, by the way, save money in the end. And therefore, that money can be spent on military capability. This is how we're trying to embed it, as I describe it, put it into the DNA of defense so that it can't reverse out of it, so it can't change. There's so much going on. It's really exciting. A lot of people in the UK MOD are very excited by the opportunities that are being presented. We just need to keep it going, and it's going to be a long slog to get to net zero, ideally by 2050. And we need to probably throw a 6 every day to make it work. But actually, the intent is there, and we're going to try and do it. I'll stop there, Steve.
Thank you so much for those comments. I really appreciated the comments at the end about changing the processes, building it into the DNA. That'll infuse it into culture. And as you know, as a military leader and as a leader in general, when you can change the culture and you can make it everybody's job, all hands on deck, it's much more durable and it has a chance to, to sustain itself like we need it to, because this can't be a temporary solution or just a passing set of policies. I would like to say, as we kick off the Q&A session, that please send questions for all the panelists, so we can also bring Tom and Sherry into this discussion also. And I'll start it off with a question that is for the entire panel. How likely do you think geoengineering will be as warming increases and the security problems that go along with it, the unintended consequences of geoengineering, since it's such a new frontier and not regulated at all, no mechanisms in place to internationally govern it? What are your concerns regarding human intervention, either non-state or state actor intervention into the natural climate systems, and in particular for NATO, what would NATO's response potentially be to geoengineering advances?
It's a very interesting and a very, very relevant question. I think if I look at the 3 pillars of NATO, then this would fall into the awareness category. So we must be aware what potential implications can be, what actions others are taking that might have a negative effect on the whole ecosystem or those infrastructures that we rely upon. I think awareness at this moment in time on the security implications of climate change, but also on geoengineering, are really insufficiently looked at by our intelligence services, but also by all the experts that do have this knowledge and need to bring it to our attention. In the broader sense, when it comes down to technology, it was mentioned by one of the earlier speakers. We used to have a time where the defense sector would be leading when it comes down to GPS, and when it comes down to nuclear technology and other technologies. At the moment, I would beg to say that this has reversed. It is now the private sector, and in a lot of aspects, it's a small and the medium enterprises, it's the academia that are creating the push for innovation. If we want to be an active player in the field of driving technological change, we need to re-engage with those communities where the actual innovation is happening in order to help us to, one, grasp the potential of new technologies when it comes down to combating climate change, but also to be an early adapter, again, as a military, be a driving force. And I'm very pleased to hear about the contract arrangement that the General just mentioned. I think this is the position that we want to be in. And NATO there is the platform for all security-related matters across the Atlantic, across 30 states, where 9 out of 10 of the top universities reside. So I think we have all the potential in-house. We just need to harness it and reconnect to it.
Are there any other panelists that would like to comment on geoengineering? Okay, why don't we move on to a question from an audience member asking the panelists to briefly highlight what you view as imminent climate security risks for the Middle East and North Africa region.
I can start on that one, Steve. Just one I would highlight, I think, and we've already seen in the past year, but it's just the rise in temperatures themselves and the risks that poses to local communities and not only to livelihoods, but also to life itself. And depending on the trajectory of temperature rise in certain parts of the world, there will be places in the Middle East, North Africa that will be unlivable for populations. And where do those people go? I think that's a key risk there to look at. Another key risk is around water, of course, and shared water resources. And that's another example of a place where it's not climate alone that is the challenge. It's climate layered on top of other governance issues, of other ethnic and political rivalries and challenges, and how that all comes together. So that's water is a second area of risk for the Middle East and North Africa that will drive population movements, potentially drive local conflicts. That is really important to look at as well.
And if I might come in with another, because I agree with both those, but another area, and that is the geopolitical shifts that are going to happen away from fossil fuels and towards rare earths, as they're called. Although I don't think they're going to be as rare as perhaps we're making out at the moment. I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, where I was told that we're going to run out of oil in 2020, and the world is going to have to change its piece by 2020 because we're all going to run out of oil. So I don't believe those rare earths are as rare, perhaps, as some people make out. But what is going to happen is there is going to be a very significant shift away from fossil fuels, and of course the Middle East is a lot of its income comes from fossil fuels, and we know that if you push in extremis because we've got it in our history across the world, that if you push a country into a corner by denying it income or gross domestic product because you're not buying what it is wanting to sell, then actually you are going to have problems with that country. And certainly some countries, and I'm not suggesting the Middle East will necessarily do this, but some countries react by sort of lashing out. And so there is a piece here about understanding the geopolitical effects of a move away from fossil fuels, understanding that what we've got to do is allow the Middle East and those countries that are heavily dependent on oil, particularly, to diversify into a different form of income and support that at a time and at a pace that is commensurate with moving away from fossil fuels as fast as possible. And this is, if you like, the Gordian knot of it'll take longer probably to diversify than it will to find alternatives to fossil fuels. And we've got to be aware of the implications, which may have security impacts of moving away on those countries that are dependent on it.
If I can just say that I fully agree with two previous speakers. And if you stack those threats, so to speak, onto each other, then I think it's one of the regions that we really need to monitor very closely and see what we can do to mitigate these risks.
Okay, I'm trying to do Q&A and I mute at the same time. So we have another question for Assistant Secretary General Van Weel, alluding to how some of the allies are already working towards some of the NATO lines of effort. And the question is, can you give examples of initiatives or best practices that others might emulate in policy or in action?
Sure, and I think one of the strengths of NATO is that you will always have, whatever the field is, whether it be technology, doctrines, etc., that the power of NATO is to bring the allies together, to create interoperability, to pull everybody up to the same level. So definitely there are allies that are more advanced than others when it comes down to combating climate change. We also have allies, of course, that have more and older and therefore heavily consuming legacy equipment. So there's all kinds of different speeds and different starting points that we need to take into account as we proceed together as an alliance. So that's why I said that using the mapping methodology that some allies have already devised and making that available for the whole alliance, for all countries, in order to be able to map their situation is a good starting point. There's also allies, and we're fostering that as NATO, that are looking, and the UK is one of them, but so is Canada and the Netherlands, is looking into more self-sufficient military camps. So this is one of the areas we're looking into. We also want to be a driver when it comes down to developing and using new technologies, especially emerging and disruptive technologies for the use of climate change. And I'll give you one example, which is, for example, the use of artificial intelligence when it comes down to planning your tanker transport aircraft planning tools. I mean, there are logistical companies out there like Amazon that have got very sophisticated software that can actually help us in reducing the use of fuel by making sure that we have more prudent planning when it comes down to this use. But there's also in the field of autonomy, and we can see that this is a very rapidly developing field, that the use of drones, now predominantly done by commercial companies when it comes down to logistics, is one of the fields that NATO, by tapping into the best practices of different countries, can help getting the full alliance to a higher level. So yes, we start at different levels, but we are a great platform in order to quickly disseminate knowledge, information, capabilities, etc., from one ally to the other.
And could I add, if you like, as a country that's absolutely committed to NATO, that Actually, one of the things that NATO has done that has been so successful over the years is produce standard NATO, if you like, systems. And the single fuels policy, I would point out, as something which is really a remarkable, absolutely remarkable piece of policy when it was introduced. This, of course, is a great threat because of all the different types of energy propulsion systems that could be around in the future as we move away from fossil fuels. And I think there's a really important aspect, which I think most people have not really just caught on board, which is we're going from, if you like, a singularity of basically oil-based fuel propulsion systems to various types. Even in the aviation world, you may have drones that are electric, short-haul aircraft that might be electric, medium-haul aircraft that might be hydrogen fuel cells, and long-haul, which might be sustainable aviation fuel and e-fuel of some sort. So even within one industry, within one part, we might have different fuel systems. It's vital, I think, that NATO remains the center of those standards, where actually we all try and work to be consistent. And whilst it may be that you have a different fuel type for each aircraft, but it's consistent across the NATO that those types of aircraft across the whole of the NATO fleet are fueled by one such, and those types of different types of aircraft are fueled by another type of fuel, but it's the same across the whole of the NATO fleet. I think that's an area where NATO is going to have to work really hard to bring that in, but it's also really important so we keep the interoperability that is so central to the way NATO works at the moment.
And I just underscore how important what I think you just said, General Nugee, is because by leading on standardization of new fuel and power types for military vehicles, aircraft, ships, etc., we will both ensure interoperability and we will be able to manage what might otherwise be natural resistance to change because of that diversity. So I just want to underscore how important it is that NATO upfront really lead on standardization as we move towards decarbonized approaches to powering our military. And I would certainly welcome the thoughts of our other leaders on this panel as to how we really take that as sort of an actionable leading effort by our militaries, because I also think that will help us manage what also could be a natural sort of critique of, well, you guys are just big emitters. We just should stop, funding you all to the same extent and et cetera. And rather than deal with that, let's focus on how we can lead and how we can stay standardized and interoperable.
If I can respond to that, it's definitely one of the things that is on the agenda. It's energy security, fortunately, is also my portfolio. So it's two sides of the same coin. What we have seen, however, that also there, where in the past the military infrastructure would probably be leading when it comes down to energy supply and security. And look at the NATO pipeline system that was built during the Cold War. We see that what happens in the private sector might be based on results, based on innovation, based on early adapters, might be the drivers for these new standards. So also that is why I plead to be closer to where innovation happens, closer to the academic world, in order to be able to be there at the moment that we see that the tendency will be to shift towards hydrogen, biofuel, electricity, and electricity coming from which source. So it's now in these times, it's very much about connecting to the world where innovation happens, and from that be quick in getting that spread out across the alliance.
Germaine, to the last three comments, we did have a question on the International Maritime Organization. And as it's based in London, and as General, you pointed out that there's going to be new demands put on the procurement change and those that support the UK military, does the panel have views on the large outsized role that the shipping industry plays in defense logistics, and the sort of the movement to bring that industry and the IMO along further, decarbonization as we move towards COP26. It's a challenge. I know that Maersk has just announced recently that they're going to have a carbon neutral ship within 2 years, about 7 to 8 years ahead of schedule. I think navies can play a role in sort of advancing and catalyzing that effort. But if there's any comments regarding the question on the relationship between defense and the IMO and the upcoming COP26.
Well, I think it's, if I might start, I think it's absolutely vital that we go, in a sense, with the grain. Despite the fact that we have now in the UK 2 massive aircraft carriers, they pale into a significant compared to the container ships that are going on around the world all the time. And the amount of money that the IMO is putting into looking at what is a sustainable fuel, what is a net zero fuel, what is the way of building ships that actually you can develop over time. We need to harness, or we need to take advantage of the money that they're putting into the R&D on that. I think if we went independently to try and work out the R&D for ourselves for our ships, then it would be a drop in the ocean. Excuse the pun. With what actually is available to the IMO. But I think there's a really there's a really important point here about legacy equipments, and the Assistant Secretary General mentioned legacy equipments. We have to take every opportunity for new equipments coming online to build in an agility with industry to be able to adapt to the most recent technological developments. I think gone are the days, and we learned this in the IT world and in the sort of cyber world really, really early on in the 1980s. If you build the hardware first, then the software can't fit in it. We need to be much more agile in the way that we develop our equipments. And the way I describe that to our procurement agency is usually with a ship, you design the engine first, so you know what energy system there is on the ship, and then you can design everything around it. I'm asking them to design the energy system last, because the energy system is the one thing that is changing really dramatically over the next 10 to 15 years. And so you don't want to build in an energy system that's going to be out of date before the thing's actually built. That sort of thinking, that sort of agility comes at a cost to the traditional way we have developed technologies. It has to be an agile partnership with industry. It has to be something where industry benefits from bringing in new technologies, and we benefit as well, rather than turning around and saying, it's a diesel engine, what do you want that goes around it? That must be the wrong answer.
If I may add, I completely agree with General Nugee's assessment of this, because I think we need new ways of looking at procurement and need to cooperate more with the industries. There are so many different kinds of technologies developing in very rapid ways. The challenge is to integrate those technologies in concepts and new capabilities. And there, I think defense can have an enormous added value by becoming the platform for innovation and allowing these companies to sit together and translate those new technologies into new concepts, using the user knowledge of the defense personnel that operates with it. And this, in the Netherlands, we call this the golden triangle between research institutes, technology centers, and defense. Bringing these together, you get a very creative process integrating these technologies and allowing yourself to be more adaptive because it is changing in an increasing pace. And the traditional way of taking 20 years to develop a new capability, it doesn't work anymore.
So we have about 6 minutes left for Q&A before I turn it over to Aaron for a closing remark. We have lots and lots of questions that have come in. Thanks so much for everybody sending in so many great questions. I'll try to combine 2 here at the end for the panel. One question is regarding NGOs and public-private partnerships, and the idea that since climate security and dealing with this climate challenge is a new kind of a new realm of security when you think of it from a traditional military standpoint. What ways can we as militaries and defense establishments work closely with NGOs, work closely with the private sector and public-private partnerships, work closely with the rest of our governments that we're not used to just working very closely with on these issues. And related to that, there's been several questions on migration, climate-fueled migration, and the challenge of dealing with that as militaries and as national security establishments going forward. So if you'd like to try to answer that, the migration question under the construct of NGOs and partnerships with the rest of society on that front, or you'd like to just deal with them separately, that's entirely up to you. But those are two questions that I put out to panelists that wants to field it.
So maybe if I can start out with the broader picture, because what you basically say is that a lot of the security issues that we're dealing with now are not purely military. They are across the government. They are not even across the government alone. They're also across the private sector. They're across academia. They're across NGOs. That there is not a single emerging security challenge within my division that has a sole military answer to it. So I think that yes, outreach, broadening our scope, a broader engagement with more different players than the regular ones is key to success here. If we succeed in having a fully resilient off-the-grid military, but our opponent is able to strike out our hospitals within 24 hours in a cyber attack, then we have lost, because societal resilience within our nations will be crucial for the defense of our security. So in a lot of cases, what I use as an analogy is that apart from the Article 5 classic collective defense, we also have to look to the below the Article 5 threshold collective security. And this is where all these issues that we've been discussing today come into play. And if we as a security organization don't address these, are not able to use our convening power in bringing these parties to the table in order to discuss, to get the mutual benefit of 30 countries reacting to them in the same way, then I think we're losing a big opportunity in creating security for the 1 billion citizens that are relying upon us in NATO.
Can I make a couple of points, because I completely agree with everything that's just been said. One point is the military is often seen with some trepidation by NGOs and are suspicious of military's intent. And I think there is often a case of people seeing the military as a weapon and, if you like, epitomized by just the weapons that we have as the last resort of defending our nations and defending our citizens, protecting our citizens. But of course, the military is much, much more than that. It has what we would call soft power, the ability to influence across the world. And NATO has a fantastic role that it does play and can play with other alliances in a way that actually isn't about wielding weapons. It's about wielding influence, advice, and intelligence, if appropriate, and certainly information. And I think that's where militaries can really support. It's the soft power that it can bring. It's the influence, it's the persuasion that it can bring, because basically we like to think of ourselves as doers and people who can get things done, and that actually operates at a if you like, conflict interventionist way as much as through our language. But there's a second point here, which is that most of us who have been on operations in the 20th century and the 21st century will recognize, of course, that in sort of almost Clausewitzian terms, the military is never the answer on its own. We should always be working with both diplomacy and the development organizations in order to try and bring together a common outcome through defense diplomacy and development. And so actually working from that angle, it's not about weapons, it's about influence, it's not just influence of the defense, it's influence that incorporates development and incorporates diplomacy as a way of getting at the answer. And I think that answers both sides of the question you asked, Steve. It's about trying to make sure that we're used appropriately rather than, if you like, as a caricature of we've got tanks, what don't you have type idea.
Well said. And with about a minute left, I'll pass it back to Erin. But once again, thanks to all the co-authors, thanks to Roll, thanks to everybody on the panel. Action. It's time for action, and take it away, Erin.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks to all our distinguished panelists and attendees today. I know I've learned something from the discussion, which is always my measure of whether it was a successful event or not. So I really appreciate everyone's participation. And I'm actually quite optimistic listening to this conversation. Again, climate change discussions can often be fairly bleak, but listening to these opportunities for action, the plans in place at the NATO summit, and then looking ahead to COP26, I think we're in a position to seize this moment. And all of my colleagues at IMCCS and part of the consortium and the panelists today, thank you for your work on these issues. Let's keep it up. And I hope all of you who attended today will stay in touch, check out our website, read the report, follow us on Twitter at IMCCS_, and join us in this important work. So thank you again. And we look forward to the next time we get together.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Take care. Have a good bike ride.
Thank you very much indeed. You'll see what I look like at the end of it.